right, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and an honor and a privilege. Thank you for having me. What I want to talk to you about very quickly in the next 25 minutes is some of the insights of the book. It's a bit more extensive that I will cover in 25 minutes, but also a little bit about Hollywood success story that Poland has been over the last 35 years. Hollywood stories because it's one of the economies in Europe that has been economically underdeveloped for 1,000 years, and I'll try to explain why. That after '89, something fundamental has changed that catapulted Poland into one of the most successful economies in Europe and in the world among countries at a similar level of income. And since I come after Professor Barry, I will also talk a little bit about the future of Poland in particular and some of the challenges, global trends, and solutions that apply to what Poland might need to be doing to sustain the miracle. And I think some of the solutions might also be relevant for Ireland. Now, a bit of history. A lot of Poles in the audience will recognize a map of Europe from 1600s. That shows what we believe still is the golden age of Poland, where it stretched geographically from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. And indeed, in Poland in 16th century, in many ways, was one of the political and cultural hegemons of Europe. For instance, about 6 to 8% of the society had voting rights, which was the largest size of an electorate that in the UK until 8030s. So it was a very unusual animal. But what we are actually not told in our historical textbooks back home is that despite this political and cultural and geographical preeminence, economically even then, Poland was already lagging behind. So this is a chart that shows GDP per capita based on the best GDP estimates we can have, and don't ask me how we can get the GDP per capita number from 16th century, but indeed there's a group of economic historians that do nothing else than actually try to go back into the past and calculate it. What the chart shows is the level of income per capita in Poland relative to the European wealth or economic development leaders. So it's Italy in 16th century, then the Netherlands until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and then it's the UK after 80-20. The bottom line from the chart is what? Students, hello. The bottom line is that for all of its history, as far as we can tell, except for the last 30 years, Poland actually lagged behind. The reason why you talk about Eastern Europe today, and even though we're not Eastern Europe, Poland is not, is because of this. All of the countries in the region, from Poland through Romania, Bulgaria, even Czechia, even Slovakia, all of these countries were way behind and had a level of incomes per capita at about 30, 40% or 58% even at its very peak. So why was Poland underdeveloped? And I spent a big proportion of the book of discussing why a village in eastern part of Poland in the 1930s looked the way it did here. Perhaps not that much different from Ireland. I don't want to hurt your feelings, but from Ireland in 19th century or so. So in that way, we are very, very similar. And what I'm trying to say is that virtually for 1,000 years of its history, at least until 1939, Poland was almost a textbook example of an oligarchic extractive society. I borrowed this concept from Acemoglu and Robinson, but I also expanded and modified it because I'm trying to explain what needs to change in order to move from an extractive to an inclusive society. For now, suffice it to say that Poland was an oligarchic society for most of its history that was ruled by a narrow elite for the benefit of a narrow elite. What it all meant is that except for a few percent of the society, the ones 5-6% that could actually vote, they would ensure that the level of literacy, access to education, the scope for development for the other classes of society were virtually closed off. Even in 1938, only 1% of Poles studied at the university level. 1% in 1938. And it was like a longue durée. It was the long wave of the society that actually said, we have no interest, I'm simplifying and exaggerating, we have no interest in letting the rest of the society, the proletariat, the peasants, the merchants, to grow, because if they grow, they can undermine our political power. So let's create a system, political and economic system, that will prevent them from doing so. Now, moving fast forward straight into 1989. I don't know if you recognize this guy. Who is he? Nice. Professor Berry, thank you. Big brownie for you. Yes. So in 1939, Poland actually was still in a very much of a periphery of a European economy, not much different than Ireland. Then we had communism, which up until 1930s, 1960s kind of worked economically, but then ended up in stagnation and bankruptcy, and ended up in pictures like these. This is a picture of what could be my grandma, and I still remember this. I was 14 in 1989. My grandma actually going to a meat store. I'm sorry, I should explain. This is a meat store. This is a meat store in Poland in 1988, where you actually had grandmas, our own grandmas, standing in line, often overnight, to actually buy some kielbasa. Really tough times. So communism in Poland in 89 ended up with bankruptcy in every single way. Macroeconomically, we had a foreign debt that was unserviceable, and it all ended up in tears. And interestingly enough, Poland was even an economic laggard among communist countries. It ended up with a lower level of income than every other communist economy except for Romania. 35 years forward, this is where we are now. One of the malls in Warsaw. I don't know if as impressive as it is in Dublin. I just went to the one next to the St. Stephen's Green Park, which is pretty nice too, but probably this one is even more modern. So what exactly, why do we have this lecture today? Why did I write the book? The reason I wrote a book is not that I'm just Polish, which helps, but also I felt that we economists, also working in global institutions like the World Bank and IMF, where I worked before and elsewhere, we just have a very narrow set of success stories. It's pretty much always Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, Ireland to some extent, and that's pretty much it. And we just regurgitating these examples all the time. And I said, this is actually not right, because you have all kinds of different examples of success, and Poland is definitely one of them. Since 1989, its GDP per person, PPP, adjusted for purchasing power, has increased by more than 3 times, from about $11,000 per person to almost $40,000 now. In terms of nominal incomes, my mom used to earn probably around $20 in '89. Now an average wage in Poland is $2,000 plus. So a fundamental difference. Also globally, if you take away China, I just put it there just to confuse you a little bit, China is still significantly poorer than Ireland or Poland. And Ireland, I should probably put a star or an asterisk, something we'll discuss in terms of like GNI development and the like. But if you take away China and Ireland, among all the other countries at the level of income of upper middle income and high income, there's no single economy in the world that would have grown faster in that period. I don't know if there's any single person in the audience that would know this fact. I doubt it. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned from this experience, particularly that this is a country that is so much unlike Asia. At the World Bank, I'm actually responsible for China and Vietnam, and I spent in Asia now almost 10 years. And I can tell you that their development model has nothing to do with the Irish or the Polish or European growth model. And I think in many ways, these models are much easier to replicate by developing countries that, for instance, very sui generis example of Korea. Now, moving a little bit towards the future. The thing that no one would expect is that if the historical trends hold from 1990, by the end of the decade or within a decade, the level of income in Poland will be as high as in Spain, Italy, or Japan. This would be totally unthinkable to any single Pole in 1989. If I told someone that by 2030 Poles will be as rich as the Spaniards, minus the leg of sun, I would be considered not entirely healthy in my mind. But this is exactly what is about to happen, and UK actually is not far away. So again, if historical trends hold, Poland's level of income, PPP, could be as high as in the UK by 2035, 2048, the latest. But our British friends are helping us as we speak, so it might be even faster than this. Thank you, Brexit. Now, a bit of drivers of success, a big, big story. I spent 200 pages on it. I divide the drivers of success into two parts. The cliche tip of an iceberg, the type of reforms that actually are visible, and what I think is fundamentally much more important is the bottom of the iceberg, which is why would countries want to adopt good economic policies in the first place? It's not like there's 120 countries around the world that are poor or are struggling to catch up and become rich. Why is that? Is it because we don't have UCD Michael Smurfit Graduate Business School and all the great knowledge that is here? Don't we have Nobel Prize winners? Don't we have World Bank and IMFs? The problem with most of these countries is that even though they know what to do to grow, there's just not enough of a willingness among the political and economic elites of these countries, to simplify and exaggerate, to actually adopt policies that support development. So the proximate causes of growth, again, a long list, no time to go through all of them. Perhaps just one I want to focus on, lack of oligarchs. And this is something that I'm particularly proud of as a Polish person, which is that Poland has stumbled, mostly because of the strength of the civil society, the legacy of Solidarność, the trade union, emergence of free media. It has actually been one of the few countries in Central Europe that have been able to privatize much later than everyone else. So Poland actually started a narrow mass privatization only in 1995, 1996, when most of the prices for state-owned assets were much more well-known than in 1990. But unfortunately, most other countries in the region have listened to the World Bank advice and they privatized in haste. What it all meant is that they sold off most of the national assets at the low price, and they ended up in the hands of oligarchs. And countries like Russia, Ukraine, Czechia, and many others in the region are still paying a heavy price for this mishandled privatization process. Now, I told you about the proximate causes of growth. Again, a long list of things that have happened, but ultimately what matters is why did Poland, for the first time in 1,000 years of its history, wanted to adopt good economic policies? And there are a number of answers here, but the key one is that we had a society that from the very beginning, unlike, for instance, unfortunately, Ukraine, knew where it was going. It wanted to return to Western Europe. It wanted to be as rich as the Germans. It wanted to be part of Europe again, and also was given a reform anchor, which is the European Union. I saw in Frank's slides that, in fact, the impact of EU funds of growth is about 0.5 percentage points per year, which is actually almost the same estimate for Poland. So it did not really matter to get all the manna from heaven in the form of EU funds. What really mattered for all of these countries in the region is to have a reform anchor that said, look, if you adopt all these kind of institutions and acquis communautaire and rules of the game, you will become part of the EU. And there was the sort of the fundamental driver of this success that I'm discussing. A little bit about the future. What will happen? Anyone wants to venture an answer? Now, for Poland, I'm actually quite optimistic. It's hard to be a prophet back home. Whenever I'm optimistic back home, people start to roll their eyes. It's like, yeah, what are you talking about? Even though we have never lived better in the history of Poland in absolute and relative terms, people are still rolling their eyes whenever you talk about the success. But the story is that even if you do not believe me, you can believe the IMF. The IMF projects that this growth story will continue, at least for another 5 years. The level of income of an average Pole will get to about 86% of the EU level of income. In relative terms, remember the beginning of the chart, the long-term history, 600 years? Poland has never been closer in terms of the quality of life to Western Europe as it is today. The new edition of the Polish version of the book has a title of The Golden Age of Poland in economic terms, because indeed that has never been the case for Poland and for every other country in the region, actually. Every single Bulgarian, Slovak, Czech, Hungarian, everyone else in the region has never had it better as they have now. And I think it's largely a credit to the European Union that, in fact, this has happened. I have a couple of more minutes, about the future and about some of the key challenges. Easy to remember, it's a business school, so I prepared 5 Ps, 5 Ds, and 5 Is, remember? So let's start with 5 Ps. I won't discuss all of the 5. One of the key challenge going forward is population aging and population decline. This is a significant challenge for Poland that we have not had in the past. Based on the current trends, by 2050, Poland will shrink from about 38 million now to about 32 million people then. And the labor market, there will be 6 million people fewer in the labor markets. So we'll have a 6 million people labor market gap by 2050. And that's obviously a big issue that for the first time make the whole society rethink the type of policies we need to actually make sure that this demographic decline and aging happening at the same time does not stymie the convergence process as happening. On trends, this is a business school. I could have a separate class on each of the 5 trends, but let me just focus on one here, and particularly that I work on China, and I've worked on China for the last 7 years, since 2017. So one of the things that is structurally different from the past is the diversification process of global value chains, or the fact that because of COVID, because of Putin's aggression onto Ukraine, because of growing competition of China, there's a global restructuring of both FDI and of the existing global value chains. So the global FDI inflows per year are about $1.5 trillion, and a big portion of this $1.5 trillion is looking for a new place to invest. Now, which countries will benefit and which countries will lose in the process? I would put my money on Poland, and Bloomberg has already announced it, because there's already a number of countries that have been recipients, have been beneficiaries of this process. In Poland, actually, the level of FDI post-pandemic has doubled relative to GDP, even despite the war in Ukraine. You would think FDI would be spooked and would be disinterested in investing in a country that's on the border with Ukraine, that is waging a war. But in fact, FDI inflows to GDP have more than doubled. And if anything, I think this trend will continue. There will be a significant redirection of global flows towards countries like Poland, probably also Ireland. And perhaps some of the debate we can have, to what extent this big redirection of FDI will benefit Ireland. I think it will, perhaps not for manufacturing, but for the headquarters and high-skilled jobs. Now, you still with me? Yes. Everyone, good. All right, we're almost there. So 5 Ps, 5 Ds, 5 Is. On 5 Is, plenty of things to talk about. Let me just focus on one thing, investment. And I think this is mostly public investment, but overall total investment. I think Poland, Ireland, and Europe as a whole severely underinvests in its future. And it really hurts me. Poland only invests about 4 to 5% of its GDP into public investment. Ireland, I just checked, invests only 2% apparently of its GDP in public investment. How much does China invest in public investment alone? 20%. How can Europe compete with the Chinas of the future if we're spending 1/10 of what China spends and all other economies in Asia? So I think this is a big challenge for Poland. This is a big challenge for Ireland. It's a big challenge for our German friends, who also underinvest and spend only about 2% of GDP on public investment. Europe, we will all become small, we'll all shrink, we'll all become irrelevant if we do not change our policy and start to invest more into our European economic muscles. Some of the key lessons, and I'm almost there. When I go to developing countries in Africa and Asia, I get frustrated when they say, oh, I want to be like South Korea. But they cannot be like South Korea because South Korea has become successful because of protectionism, because of corruption, because of state subsidies, which are totally unacceptable today, and because of a very different cultural norm which prevented the business sector from capturing the state. So all the Samsungs and Hyundais, for some reason, they were always subsidized by the state, but they never captured the state to the extent that would undermine economic policy. None of the countries in Africa have the same kind of conditions that will allow them to replicate South Korean growth model. I think Ireland and Poland are much closer to what these countries can actually achieve, including because of the focus of FDI as the key source of growth and competitiveness. So that's, I think, what Ireland has much in common. And finally, what I noticed in Ireland, I'm not sure about the weather today, but on Sunday I went to the Howe Peninsula, which was just a lovely day with lots of sunshine, blue skies, amazing breeze. I just loved it. And reminded me of this chart here, which is that GDP is not the only thing that matters. You have to go beyond GDP and look at the quality of life. Interestingly enough, at least based on this OECD Better Life Index ranking, Poland has a higher quality of life than Japan and Korea, even though both of these countries are about 20–30% richer per capita today. So it means that Poland has not only been able to grow, but has grown in a way that has allowed it to translate growing incomes into growing quality of life. We are just about to catch up with Ireland, hopefully soon. Keep this rain going. We might get there sooner than otherwise. So to sum up, I wanted to share with you the story, and please, hopefully you will find some time to look at it more. It is really, the book is not only about Poland. It tries to take the example of Poland and explain what makes countries rich and what keeps them poor. How is it that a country that for 1,000 years was virtually an example of a failed state economically, suddenly has made it over the last 30 years and has become, next to Ireland, the fastest growing economy in Europe and in the world. So I think this is a story that needs to be studied also at business schools. And I think one of the things we also need to talk about for Poland and for Ireland, what do we do next? How do we make sure that we sustain this economic miracle, not that has happened for the last 33 years, but what do we do to keep it going for another 33? Thank you.